Hi, my name is Joe Lima. I was born in Luís Graciosa, Azores, the Azores. I came to the United States when I was 13 years old. Before I came to the US at the age of 13, I went to school. I had the 4 years of grammar school, only 4 years in the Azores. That was the extent of it. Once we finished grammar school, we had to go back to go to work. And at 10 years old, I started working for a fish cannery, tuna fish, and worked there for 2 years. It's interesting, my brother was mentioning about something about some of the experiences in the Azores, and we were fairly poor, and especially in relative to today's society. And I didn't have any shoes until I was about 12 years old when I got my first pair of shoes. And as you know, in the Azores there's a lot of vines that have thorns in them that you get when you walk without shoes. You have to be careful you don't step on it. So when I got my first pair of shoes, what I wanted to do was just to go out there with the shoes and step on these thorns, because I wanted to, I wanted some power over these vines that were out on the ground. Anyway, at the age of 13, came to the U.S. Since I was 13 years old, I could not go to work. I had to go to school. There was a law in California. I had to go to school, so I went back to school. A couple years of grammar school, then finished high school in the city of Turlock, which is the community here. And then from high school, I went to junior college, Modesto Junior College, 2 years, got an AA degree. And then from there, I went to Cal Poly San Luis Obispo, and I got a BS in agricultural engineering. With my education, the background and our education in soils and water, I went to work for a company in Bakersfield in irrigation, a very large company. They had 43,000 acres of land, international company. It was owned by a Superior Oil Company and then Mobil Oil Company. The big oil company owned this farming company. I worked there for 17 years. During that time, 1976, I spent 1 year in Iran working with irrigation systems, installation of irrigation systems. I was an advisor to the Ministry of Agriculture on those installation systems. After that period of the 1 year, came back to California, back to irrigation again. We were building a lot of drip irrigation, very advanced irrigation systems. Drip irrigation and micro sprinklers, another type of irrigation that's very efficient. And then 3 years later, or 4 years later, 1984, I went to Italy. I worked in Italy for 3 years. A Superior Farming Company owns varieties, patented varieties and trademark varieties of grapes, table grapes primarily, stone fruit. And in Italy, we had a contract with an Italian company to sell those varieties, to contract mostly those varieties in Europe, mostly in the Mediterranean countries, Portugal, Spain, France, Italy, and then North Africa, Morocco, Tunisia, and Egypt, and some of the Middle Eastern countries. So I spent 3 years doing that, came back to the U.S., spent another year in the U.S., then ended up going to Chile in 1987. I spent 2 years in Chile, doing basically the same thing with one exception, that in Chile, actually we grew the varieties. We grew the fruits and table grapes in Chile and exported to the U.S. Exported to the U.S. because in the summer months we have a lot of fruits and vegetables here, but in the winter months we do not. And so there's a lot of fruits and vegetables that come from South America to California, especially from Chile. Chile is a big grower of winter fruits and vegetables. Then 1989, I decided to do something else rather than work with a company. I came to the city of Modesto, right in the center of the San Joaquin Valley, to work for a utility company, utility in the electrical business and water business. We deliver, the Modesto Irrigation District, the name of the company, delivers the water to the farming community of the Central Valley, and then also delivers domestic water to the city of Modesto and some of the cities in the surrounding area. And then, of course, electricity. We generate our own power and deliver to the city of Modesto. And so that brings to the present time. I've been involved in a lot of functions. I forgot to mention in the Portuguese version of it that I am currently the president of the Modesto Lions Club, Clube dos Leões da Cidade de Modesto. And that brings us to the present. The fact that I was born in the Azores and grew up there and came to the United States, you never forget that you are Portuguese. And of all the travelings that I have done, I always very aware of my nationality. When I traveled in the countries of the Middle East, Israel, I forgot to mention Israel. I was in Israel also. I used to go from Israel to Jordan, which is right across from one and the other. Yet I had to go from Israel to Egypt and then from Egypt to Jordan because we couldn't get across the borders of Israel and Jordan. I carried a passport, an American passport when I did that, but in the passport they stated that I was born in Portugal. And so as I went to the local immigration or the people at those countries, they always look at that. And especially when I was traveling between those countries, there were a lot of suspicions. Here's a guy working with Italians, with a group of Italians, with the American passport, born in Portugal, and there was all kinds of questions. Who are you? What are you doing here? Why are you in these countries? So it was very interesting. But yeah, you never forget that you are Portuguese, and it's interesting. I always was listening to Portuguese speaking if there was. And when I was in Iran, I happened to be walking down one of the streets, the main streets of Iran, where a group of people standing on the corner, speaking Portuguese. And so I couldn't stay, I had to stop and ask them what they were there speaking in Portuguese. And they told me that they had left Portugal. There was no jobs in Portugal at that time. This is 1976, right after the revolution. And they had no jobs and they had to go to Iran. Iran gave them some jobs at the time of the Shah before the Khomeini government came in. And so, I had the opportunity to speak Portuguese with them, which was great. I had the radio. I had the radio station. I bought a radio, and I listened to the radio station, always looking for Portuguese music. You get tired of listening to the BBC, and you want to, see. So I bought a shortwave radio so I could listen to the Portuguese station. So again, you never forget. The same thing when I was in Italy. I learned Italian in the 3 years I was there. The Portuguese helped me a lot. The fact that I knew Portuguese to learn the Italian. And people ask the question, who are you? I'm from Portogallo. That's what they call it in Italian, Portogallo. And they thought that was very interesting. There's a guy from Portugal that went to the United States and then is back in Europe working in Italy. So that was all very interesting. Same thing in Chile. I went to Chile, and not too many Portuguese people in Chile. But I always was looking for Brazilians or something like. We had a very close friend in Chile that was Brazilian. Every time we got together, we spoke in Portuguese. So it was interesting because his wife was Chilean, but she knew English very well. We would go to a restaurant, and his wife, and my wife would be speaking English, and I and him would be speaking Portuguese in a Chilean restaurant. That people couldn't figure out what the heck was going on here. So you run into a lot of those interesting stories and interesting situations over those experiences. I would like to mention that when we came to the United States, we were some of the first immigrants, the big wave of immigrants that came from the Azores to California in the early 1960s. A lot of them were coming from the Azores right after the volcano in the Azores, the Capelinos in Ufayal. And as a result of that, they were just coming in. A lot of them, as I mentioned earlier, were going to work. I and two other kids from this area were the first immigrants to the United States, to California, that ended up going to the university, the local university, Cal Poly San Luis Obispo, which is in the coast. And so after that point in time, as more immigrants came in, then more and more went to school. But I was on the first wave of immigrants that went to the university here and they got a university degree.
I'm Vivian Manha, and my Portuguese name is Vivian Manha, and I was born in Turlock, California, where I still live. And actually, I still live in the same house to which I was born. My mom and dad built the house the year I was born, which I think is a bit unusual. And they are both deceased, and so I inherited the house, and so I'm still here. My mother and father were both born in the Azores, actually in the freguesia of Lomba on the island of Flores. But interestingly, both of my grandfathers had lived in the United States. One grandfather, my mother's father, lived in Massachusetts, I believe it was Fall River, for 20 years before he was married. And then he went back to the Azores, got married, and did make several trips back and forth, but I don't know when or how many. On my dad's side, his father came out to Nevada to work as a sheep herder in the sheep fields in Nevada. And so my father and mother were both born in the Azores. Neither of my grandmothers ever came to the United States. Why, I'm not sure, but I think one wasn't interested, and the other one actually died young, so she didn't have the opportunity to come. My mom and dad were childhood sweethearts in this little village, and father wanted to immigrate. I think maybe mother wasn't as interested as he was, but she wanted to marry him, so the arrangement was that he was to come to the United States, earn some money, and when he had enough for them to get married and establish a home, then she would follow. And that is exactly what happened. Dad went to work in a mine in Nevada. Dad came, I believe, in 1908, and he was there 1 year, and of course it snows in Nevada, and from the Azores he didn't know what snow was. He didn't like the snow. He was underground in the mine, and he had always, every day he went swimming. He was a beautiful swimmer. Every day in the Azores had gone swimming. Well, working in a mine just was not for him. And he realized this, and so after a year, he decided he would leave Nevada and come to California. So he actually came to California in 1909, and he worked on a grain ranch. There was no irrigation in those years, and so this great big ranch in Montpelier, California, which is maybe 20 miles from Turlock. He lived with a family there and drove a 20-mule team and harvested the grains. Well, my father quickly learned that he hated mules. He just didn't. He said they were so stubborn and they wouldn't do what they said. So one day he was in Turlock for a festa, and he ran into an elderly man who was from Flores. And I guess my dad at this time, this would have been probably 1910 already. And at this time he knew that he didn't want to stay on the grain field, in the grain fields. And he told this man, this other immigrant, the elderly man, of his unhappiness. And the man said to him, "Well, what do you think you'd like to do?" And he said, "Well, I don't know," but he said, "I did like at the mine. I didn't like going down, but I loved to help the blacksmith. And they used to let me help." So this man said, "Hey, it just happens that I've been at the blacksmith shop this morning. I've left some work for them to do. I'm going back there to pick up my work, and I'll talk to them." And this, the man did this, and he came back and he said, "The blacksmith says he will take you on as an apprentice." if you want to do that. Well, my dad was just delighted, and so that's finally what brought him to Turlock. And he went to work at the blacksmith shop in 1911. And it was 3 years, however, before he had saved enough money to write to my mother and say, I'm ready for you to come. So she arrived in 1913. And so my mom and dad were actually married at St. Stanislaus Church in Modesto, California in September of 1913. So my mother came then in 1913 to be married. And at that period of time, I find it interesting that my dad had attended the first festa in Turlock, which was held on a canal bank. There was no building, no fairgrounds, nothing like that at that time in Turlock. So the festa actually was literally on the canal bank. And Mother wasn't here yet. She came that year, but the festa had already occurred when she came, and so she only got to go to the second one, which was the following year, and was still on the canal bank. Later, not much later, they actually built a capella, which still stands today and is the grounds where the festa is currently held. So my dad had started working at this blacksmith shop that was an established shop, and then he became very good friends with one of the other workers. And a couple of years later, when the owner decided that he was going to retire, he sold the shop to my father and the other man who's born in the United States. And they had the shop together until 1922, and then his partner drowned. It was on July 4th, and he had gone picnicking, and on the way home they decided that they were going to go swimming in the canal. And unfortunately, he drowned that afternoon. And so in 1922, then, my dad took over the shop, and he owned and ran the shop until he retired at the age of 65. In the meantime, my sister, and I have only one sister, no brothers, and my sister married a machinist. And so he started a small shop inside of my dad's blacksmith shop. And then when Dad retired, my brother-in-law bought the whole shop, and that shop still exists and is running and is in the estate of my sisters. Both my sister and her husband have passed on, but the shop continues and is now manufacturing hydraulic cylinders. And so it's high-power hydraulics in Turlock, California. It's very interesting to me that the immigrants coming now to Turlock don't really realize the struggle that the older immigrants had. My dad came with a bedroll. He came steerage, and he had to borrow the money for his passage. And of course, when he got here, that was the first thing that had to be repaid, was the passage. And it took him 3 years to get established. And then when Mother came, and of course, I was born 12 years after Mother had immigrated. So I really didn't see the real struggle that my sister did. My sister was 11 years older than I am, and she saw them when they had nothing. The shop was not paid for, and you didn't spend a penny that you didn't have to. You grew your coives in the backyard, and you grew your own tomatoes, and you didn't spend money at the grocery store except for the basics. You didn't buy clothes in the finer shops. Thank goodness that Turlock had a J.C. Penney's. And that's where my mother, of course, bought all of her clothes and bought our clothes. But my sister's life was a little different than mine, too, being 11 years older. She knew the Depression, which I did not. It was still going on when I was a child, but I was too young to understand. By the time I knew things about the economy, we were getting ready for World War II, and things were pretty good. Unfortunately, that's the good side of a war, is that there are jobs for people. And so, and we didn't have any boys, so we didn't suffer as people did whose sons had to go and fight the war. But I wish to the day that she died, my mother kept every piece of string. She'd roll it into a great big ball, even short pieces. Sometimes you'd go to wrap a gift, or not a gift, you don't wrap gifts with string, but a package. And you'd think you were going to have a big piece of string, and you had 6 inches of string. So when they talk about people saving string, I know exactly what they're talking about. You didn't eat in restaurants. There certainly was no fast food. And in fact, the only time I can remember my dad eating out, not coming home for lunch, was if Mother and I would go shopping. We had to go to Modesto because we went to Modesto for Easter dresses and for school dresses, and it was Easter and Christmas. Oh, and the festa. I always got a new dress, and Mother got a new dress, and my sister got a new dress for the festa. I notice in the schools that there has been so much change from the time that I was in school to our schools now, with the multiplicity of ethnic groups and incorporating ethnic elements in our schools and having them appreciate each other. It's a beautiful thing for me to see, because when I was a child, this was not so. We attempted to hide the fact that we were children of immigrants, and we were embarrassed when our parents couldn't speak English. My dad spoke very good English because he was in business, and I think that, he learned that way. My mother's English, she spoke, went to the bank, everything that she needed to do, but she did not speak what we would call proper English. And that was embarrassing to me and my friends who were in the same position. And that's one thing I do praise the schools for, how much that situation has improved. But it was only a few years ago that a girl from my first grade and I were talking about this, and her parents were Swedish, and mine, of course, Portuguese. And I started laughing, and I said, Carmen, I would have died in elementary school if you had known that I spoke Portuguese. Well, she started laughing, and she laughed and laughed until the tears were rolling down her face, and she said, and you never knew that I spoke Swedish. And I didn't, and we were best friends. But it was just a different time, a different era, and we were supposed to be Americans. But it was true. My sister and I used to talk about that, and of course she was born in 1914, so she was really a child of the 20s. And if anything, it was worse for her. And one thing that we don't like to mention, but there were no Portuguese teachers, teachers of Portuguese descent. They didn't go to college. They didn't become teachers. And had they become teachers, they wouldn't be hired. So there was, now we call it discrimination. I don't know what they called it at that time. And I had a family friend. He was he was my sister's age, And he was a graduate of the University of California, which is a prestigious school. And he wanted to teach at the high school here. And he had a faculty friend, and the faculty friend had become principal, and he point blank told him, he said, I want to hire you, but the board will never hire a Portuguese or a Catholic. But that was in the early 30s. I graduated from the university in the late 40s, and I was offered an administrative position at that same high school. So we had come a long ways in actually less than 20 years, from not being able to hire a teacher to actually hiring an administrator. So times, very fortunately, have changed. But I was still in the area, really, and I know people really don't always like to hear this, but Portuguese girls did not go to college. If you finished high school, that was great, and if you got a job as a teller at the bank, you had really, for a Portuguese girl, you had really arrived. I was, and my sister, we were very fortunate, and we don't know why or what the difference was, but our parents were very interested in our getting an education. And so my sister she finished 2 years of junior college, and she would have gone on, except she got married the day after graduating from junior college, so that took care of that. And I went on to junior college, and then I went to Stanford and graduated there and got a teaching credential and went into teaching and later administration. So in that period of time, it became very different. And now I see the children of immigrants and even immigrants themselves going on to college, going to the university, some of them getting doctorate degrees, and it's just a beautiful evolution of thinking that I have witnessed during my lifetime. When I went to Modesto Junior College, as far as I know, I was only the third Portuguese person who had been on the staff. The head of the agriculture department, Ruben Silva, had been there for a number of years, and there was also a woman on the staff who had been there several years before I came, but she had denied being Portuguese. She never let anyone know, but I think that at the time that she was hired, had she been Portuguese, that she might not have been hired, plus being a woman. And I know myself that I was the first woman hired in the mathematics department. Prior to that time, it was a man's world. So I was in this interesting situation of watching both the ethnic development and the women's movement. So they were interesting years. Then when I came to Modesto Junior College, the women in town, several women in town, had organized an international students club. Most of these women had gotten into this work because they had students living in their homes, and they felt that the students needed to socialize with each other from different countries, and then it gave them a chance also to teach the students American ways. So they asked me if I would also be a campus advisor for the group. And so I became involved with the International Students Club. And we had students from many different countries. Modesto Junior College really went all out to get students to come. And particularly in agriculture, we're known internationally. So I had students from the Azores. When I first went to JC, which was 1959, it was mostly men students, but in the 27 years that I was there, we were getting a lot of women, both women immigrants and foreign students coming in. We had several Brazilians as well as students from the Azores. So it was a real eye-opener to me. And interestingly enough, most of the male students were interested in engineering. So they were also part of our math department. And then I actually didn't teach math there very long. I was there 27 years, but I went into administration. And then I became, let's see, I was in counseling, and I was chairman of counseling. I became dean of instruction, and I was the first woman to be hired there. So I was the first woman dean of instruction and the first Portuguese woman dean of instruction. Well, probably the first Portuguese dean of instruction. So but they were interesting times. But I retired in 1985, and now it's a life of travel, including going back to visit the Azores again.